You may have heard it said that the Gospels are like a decades-long game of telephone where the stories grew and grew over time until they were basically unrecognizable. But is that true? Let's get into it. Bart Ehrman, in his brief introduction to the New Testament, puts the objection like this. You are probably familiar with the old birthday party game Telephone. A group of kids sit in a circle and first tells a brief story to the one sitting next to her, who tells it to the next, and so on, until it comes back full circle to the one who started it. Invariably, the story has been changed so much in the process of retelling that everyone gets a good laugh. If it didn't work this way, who would play the game? Now imagine this same activity taking place, not in a solitary living room with 10 kids on one afternoon, but over the expanse of the Roman Empire, some 2,500 miles across, with thousands of participants, from different backgrounds, with different concerns, and in different contexts, some of whom have to translate the stories into different languages. The basic idea is that the traditions concerning Jesus were quickly passed on from person to person while slowly or quickly growing and changing over time. What we have in the final form of the Gospels would be a shell of what the original story was. Most who take this objection will still affirm that there are kernels of truth in the Gospels, meaning that we can still learn truth about the historical Jesus from their narratives. However, this amount of knowledge we can gain is vastly limited due to the mythological growth over time. But is this true? Are we severely limited in our knowledge that we can know about Jesus? And are the Gospels the result of a decades-long game of telephone? No. And here's why. Quick note here as well, the way that I'm going to format this response is that if you were just looking for a quick and easy answer to this question, I'm going to provide that now at the beginning of my response. And then if you want to get more in depth and learn more and more about the gospel traditions themselves, stay tuned to the end of the video and hopefully you'll learn a lot. Now let's get back to why the Gospels are not like the telephone game. The entire point of the telephone game is for the last person to say something completely different than what the original message said. And the rules are set up in such a way so as to make sure that's what happens. You can only whisper the message to the person next to you, and you're only allowed to do so one time, with no repeat attempts. This basically guarantees that the concluding message will be different than the original. But why on earth would we think that the gospel traditions are anything like this? Skeptics traditionally say this because the Gospels are written at least a couple of decades after the events in question, and so they argue that basically this leaves a lot of time for mythology to creep in. But here's why I think that doesn't work. The first century Christian movement is what we would call an oral tradition. This means that the teachings of Jesus would be memorized and performed for groups of people so that they could know the message that Christ came to tell the world. You should already be able to see how this is different from the telephone game. There is no memorization or performance of the message in the telephone game. There's also no rule in an oral tradition that the sayings of Jesus could not be repeated. Additionally, the goal of traditions being performed was so that people could actually know what the original message was. The goal wasn't for the message to get lost, like it is in the telephone game. So hopefully you can see by the diametrically opposed purposes of the telephone game and the Jesus traditions why this analogy doesn't work. And now, as I said, that's going to be your easy answer for this video. If you want to get a little bit more into the weeds and be a bit more of a Bible nerd, then stay tuned to the end of the video. The analogy falls apart even more when we start to analyze the kind of oral tradition that the Gospels were. The Gospels are formal, controlled traditions. This means that they have authoritative guarantors of the tradition at the top, making sure that the content of the tradition is not being carelessly added on to over time. The content of the Gospels are not drastically changing over time without regard for truth. The stories are being carefully monitored by authoritative guarantors to make sure that the tradition lines up with how the historical events really happened. In oral traditions similar to this one, if someone wandered too far from the story, those listening to the performance would interject and correct the mistake. The allowable variation was anywhere between 10% and 40%, which, as Craig Blomberg states, it's an interesting coincidence that 10 to 40% is pretty consistently the amount of variation we see among the synoptics on any given passage. There might be a skeptic watching and thinking, well, how do we know that the Gospels are formal, controlled traditions? What reasons do we have for thinking that the traditions were not growing and expanding over time? Well, if that's the question you're asking, I'm going to give you 3 lines of evidence for the rest of this video. The first line of evidence is going to be the teaching style of Jesus and his followers. Rainer Reisner says, Many of the isolated traditions in the Synoptic Gospels would match the definition of the ancient kriya, which is a useful anecdote, in which the student memorizes small units of a master's teaching and learns how to adapt and apply them in various settings. The oldest extra New Testament notice by Papias of Hierapolis about the prehistory of a gospel shows Peter himself teaching his memories of Jesus in the form of kriya. In other words, Jesus' teaching in the Synoptic Gospels are in the form of short, memorized sayings that would be circulated by authoritative witnesses to the traditions. We have testimony from Papias in the 1st century that Peter preached in the form of Jesus' kriya that he received presumably by Jesus himself. Jeffrey Tripp adds, students were strongly encouraged to understand the masters by playing with their words, to modify them by deliberately taking up some sentences and turning them in as many ways as possible. Students learned through paraphrase, and they would alter statements to clarify them, draw out otherwise obscure truths, or simply polish the aesthetics. When we combine these ideas together that Jesus' sayings in the Gospels are small, memorized traditions, and that students were encouraged to modify them to elucidate the teachings further, it makes perfect sense of the 10 to 40% variation in the synoptics that we noted earlier. We can also look at how Luke discussed tradition in the 1st chapter of his Gospel, and how Paul talked about tradition in his letters. Reisner continues, when writing his Gospel, Luke relied on the oral tradition as it was handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. The use of the technical term handing on in Greek, paradidomai, points to the delivering of a cultivated tradition. Part of these pre-Pauline cultivated traditions found in Paul's letters that he received are hymns, creeds, and the traditions surrounding baptism and the Lord's Supper. So hopefully we can see that the passing on of memorized and cultivated traditions strongly contrasts with the idea of the telephone game. And that was only our first line of evidence, and we have 2 more that I want to give to you really quickly. Matthew and Luke both independently use Mark as a source, but when they use Mark as a source, they often copy him word for word, and often in the same chronological order of events as Mark presents them. They are, in fact, more conservative with Mark's material than the Jewish historian Josephus is with the Old Testament scriptures. This use of Mark by Matthew and Luke reflects a careful preservation of the Jesus tradition by Jesus' disciples and their followers. And our final line of evidence that the Gospels are formal controlled traditions rather than growing mythologies over time is going to be from Papias of Hierapolis in the 1st century. He says, along with the interpretations, I shall not hesitate to add all that I ever learned and carefully remembered from the elders, for I am sure of its truth. And whenever anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I asked about their words, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and what Aristion and the presbyter John, disciples of the Lord, were still saying. So even after the apostles had passed away, we can see that the earliest Christians cared about what the authoritative guarantors of the traditions had to say. They did not want growing mythologies over time. In conclusion, the Gospels do not even remotely resemble the telephone game. The point of the telephone game is for the original message to be lost, which is completely disanalogous to what we see in the Gospels and in the early church. The Gospels, in contrast, display the markers of what we would call a formal, controlled oral tradition. The sayings of Jesus are reliably preserved, and short, memorized, and cultivated traditions, with only slight variations within the range encouraged at that time, which were compiled and written down for us by eyewitnesses in the form of ancient biographies. The purpose of these biographies, based on these observations, would be to pass down reliable history regarding the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which is in complete opposition to the purpose of the telephone game. We can reliably conclude, therefore, that the Gospels are so unlike the telephone game that it is almost as miraculous as the resurrection itself that this is an objection raised against them. If you stuck around to the end, leave a comment down below if you learned anything, and thank you so much for watching this video on why the Gospels are completely unlike the telephone game. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.